Jesus then said to the Jews who had believed in him, "If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." They answered him, "We are descendants of Abraham, and have never been in bondage to anyone. How is it that you say, 'You will be made free'?" Jesus answered them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not continue in the house forever. The Son continues forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed." The Gospel of the Lord. In America, we often pride ourselves on our freedom. It's a big part of our identity, our culture. Our biggest celebration as a country is the 4th of July, celebrating our independence. Our second biggest, Thanksgiving, also has major overtones of freedom. And we regard ourselves as a free people. And yet, if we look closely at our daily lives, it is well worth reflecting on how free we actually are. While we can rightly regard ourselves as free from a king or from anyone telling us what to do, we might realize, if we really look closely at how we act and behave, the decisions we make, the words we speak, there are forces at work within us that really compel a lot of what we do. And so how free actually are we? Jesus picks up this topic in the 8th chapter of John. When talking with a group of Jewish people who had believed in him, he says, "If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Now, the obvious reading of this at face value indicates that those who follow Jesus, who listen closely to his teachings and obey them, living them out as disciples, that they will by that come to know the truth. And by practicing the teachings of Jesus will be free, will be made free from sin. For he says, everyone who commits a sin is a slave to sin. The slave has no permanent place in the household. The Son has a place there forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. And the overall understanding is that we will be freed from our sin by following Jesus. Now, this is an obvious and plain reading of the Scriptures, and it's, of course, valid. But there's another sense in which I think this might be true as well, a different perspective on this text, which perhaps is truer to life for some folks who have, vivid experiences or life-changing transformations in coming to know Christ. For indeed, I know a number of people in my own life who, coming to know Jesus and accepting him, receiving him into their lives, have experienced a sudden change of their lives. People who were addicted to drugs or alcohol, or were living in really abusive lifestyles, or in really unhealthy ways of life, and that almost in an instant, coming to know Christ and accept Christ, those desires were completely taken away from them, and it wasn't so much an embracing and a living out deliberately of teachings through practice and discipline, as much as it was just a life-changing encounter with the goodness of God in Jesus Christ. And I'd like to delve into that a little bit and see if it might be helpful for you to look at things this way as well. It's at least worth, I think, considering. Jesus, in the Gospel of John, frequently uses the word truth. He says here that if you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Throughout the Gospel of John, truth is kind of a key word, and it keeps popping up. And in every case, or I should say, in many conspicuous cases, this truth actually refers to Jesus himself. In the very beginning of this Gospel, in 1:14, the word was full of grace and truth. And again, in verse 17, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. There's a sense of truth being revealed in fullness, decisively, in this person of Jesus. There's also interesting references later on when Jesus says, not only I am the way, the truth, and the life, but he says, I am the true vine, Not just I am the vine, I am the true vine, expanding on those passages in Ezekiel that talk about God as being the vine pruner. He says, I am the true vine. Likewise, he says, he is the true bread sent down from heaven. In this way, Jesus is the truth, enfleshed, made real among us. And here in this very own passage, he says, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And yet just a couple verses later, he says, if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. And it's almost as if in coming to know the truth, he's actually saying, coming to know him, coming to know who he is. It's a terrible irony that in Jesus' conversations with Pilate near the end of this gospel, Pilate famously asks Jesus, what is truth? With no reply. And I had a very interesting professor once who put the question, what if truth is a person? And in this sense, coming to know the truth is to come to know Christ himself, and that Christ, the Son, is the one who sets free, who liberates. There's also a second word here that's used, and that's continue in my word. And that word actually means to abide, to make home at. And Jesus likewise picks up this word elsewhere here in this gospel. This also is kind of an important key word. Again, at the beginning of the gospel, it says the word came and dwelt among us, or pitched its tent. It made its home among us. And so too in chapter 14, this word appears again, where Jesus says in 14:2, in my Father's house there are many dwelling places, and I go to prepare a place for you and will come and take you so you can be where I am myself. This dwelling place is drawn from the same word. Means to live in, to abide, to make one's home at. And so one can understand this passage as saying, not necessarily if you will hear my teachings and obey them, then you will be made free, although that's perfectly valid. Another way of looking at this, using these same words, but with this kind of more expansive sense taken from where these words occur elsewhere in John, is that if we come to know Christ and make our home with him, if we continue in him, that knowing him, that he will set us free, which perhaps is a little more powerful for those who have had those transformative experiences of getting to know the grace of Christ. Interesting, too, in this exchange that Jesus has with those Jews who had believed in him, they ask in response, we are sons of Abraham, or descendants of Abraham. We have never been slaves to anyone. What does it mean that we will be made free? And this is perhaps a little ironic, for those of us who know the history of the Hebrew peoples. They had been slaves to the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and even now they're kind of under the vassalship of Rome. And so in one sense, they're really not free, but they likewise regard themselves as we do also, as free people, even though, of course, in our history, not all of us have been free. But Jesus interestingly continues with, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not have a place in the house forever. The Son has a place in the house forever. And if the Son makes you free, you shall be free indeed. Jesus doesn't dispute here that they are descendants of Abraham, but he follows up with this somewhat curious saying that the slave has no permanent place in the household. The Son has a permanent place in the household. And what he's in all likelihood referring to is the same story that Paul picks up in Galatians 4, where he uses Abraham and his descendants as an allegory, an illustration. Abraham, of course, as we know, actually had two descendants, Ishmael through Hagar, the handmaid of his wife Sarah, and Isaac through Sarah. And Ishmael was, though his progeny was born of a slave, and Isaac was born of his wife, Sarah, in freedom. And if we read again the story of Abraham in Genesis, we can see how God repeatedly made a promise to Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars. This is made again and again, a handful of times. However, by chapter 16 of Genesis, Abraham and Sarah are both very old, And Sarah says, why don't we give Hagar to Abraham as his wife so that he can indeed bear a descendant? In this way, Abraham and Sarah and Hagar basically take matters into their own hands. Rather than trusting in the promise of God, as unlikely, as incredulous as it was, they work another way through their own decision, through their own will, their own planning, and they come and they thereby produce an heir for Abraham. However, there is strife as a result of this. Hagar looks contemptuously on Sarah because Sarah cannot bear a child, and Sarah drives her out. And it is not until later in the story that God fulfills his promise through Sarah, though she is very old at this point. Nonetheless, the child of the promise is born, and it is through Isaac that the covenant is made. And while God blesses both, the covenant, the promise, the plan is effected through the lineage of Isaac. Paul draws on this in his analogy in Galatians 4 on being a slave versus being free. And he writes, "It is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise." One of the overall messages of the Gospel of John is stated at its outset, that for all who believed in Christ and received him, God gave the power to become children of God. And Jesus can, I think, rightly be understood to be teaching here that those who receive him, that dwell in his word, in him, for the word indeed became flesh, that in him, that through the promise, through God's gracious workings, we will be made free from sin, for Christ overcomes sin and death, and we are thereby freed from its bondage. Jesus, in the Gospel of John, in fact, in all the Gospels, he was always debating with the Jews about observing the ritual Mosaic law, and he struggled with them against their understanding that it was by these works of the law that they were made righteous before God. Jesus, in fact, seems to step over the law when he heals people on the Sabbath, when he associates with unclean persons and so forth. And yet, Jesus, when he himself is asked here in this gospel, what is the work of God that they should perform? He answers very simply that the work of God is this: to believe in him whom he has sent. That the work, that what they should and what we should all do, is to believe and to trust, to live in that grace, to take hold of the promise, and that it is Christ himself who overcomes sin and death, and in him we too are freed from the power of sin. So this is just a different reading here of John 8 than what might naturally occur to us when we first come across this text, but one, I think, that is more powerful in its understanding, but also resonates more powerfully with other passages and other words found elsewhere here in this gospel and in other books of the Bible. So I hope this was of some benefit to you. All God's people said, Amen.